So again, we're still kind of staying at the larger level before we get specific into archives and how climate change impacts our work as archivists. But this part that I'm going to work on is, or walk you through, is based on, so I taught last summer a 5-day seminar course for California Rare Book School that was called Archives and Climate Change. And when I was building that 5-day seminar, I felt very strongly that I had to put something in about climate grief and climate emotions at the very beginning. So it was like the second day of that 5-day workshop, and it was all online. We had people from all around the country who were part of this seminar, as well as various points in their career. So we had everyone from people who are still new MLIS students all the way to executive directors of organizations. And the reason that I felt so strongly about front-loading content about climate grief into that is because there is so much about climate change, thinking about the mental health part of this, that can really be very difficult to grapple with. And I have been working on climate change issues for, goodness, probably about 7 or 8 years at this point. And so I have gone through many cycles of my own where I'm like, oh my, good Lord, this is very overwhelming. This is frightening. This is scary. This is depressing. Sometimes I have also felt quite nihilistic and rageful. And so I always feel like it's really important to talk about this because it, one, doesn't get talked about enough. And two, I just am all about normalizing talking about climate emotions. I think a lot of people tend to take a very utilitarian, just tell me what I need to do and then we'll, deal with it. But so much about climate change and the way we orient ourselves towards it deals with issues of the future, and it deals with issues of control. And, when people feel like they are losing control over situations, that often affects their impressions about the future and their relationship to the future. And that can be profoundly disorienting. So because of that, it's really important to deal with what I sort of largely term as climate grief, but lots of climate people talk about climate emotions or climate anxiety. It takes a lot of different forms. So that's what we're going to talk about for a little while here. Okay, so some basics. Climate, all of these things, they are a normal and natural reaction to the climate crisis and ecological loss. We are not separate from nature. We are not separate from the environment. We are a part of it. And so when we are seeing loss around us, that is going to inevitably impact us, and we are inevitably going to have reactions to that. And I subscribe to the school of thought that there are no, quote unquote, bad emotions, that emotions are sources of information. And in order to sort of live with those emotions and use them in productive ways, we can treat them as sources of information. A lot of folks in the climate change and climate policy and climate activist spaces have spent a lot of time talking about how joy and connection are really invaluable parts of this work. And that is because there's a lot about climate change that, can lead people to very dark places, can make people feel very, very pessimistic, very nihilistic. I think it is also worth talking about that these really overwhelming emotions can also sometimes be ripe for some really scary things. So there are, a lot of reactionary and right-wing groups that will often sort of capitalize on this in ways that are deeply unhealthy. So an example of this is when sometimes you'll see people talking about, fear of how climate change is changing migration patterns. And so one of the things that I feel like is so essential to tending to our own emotions is so that we do not become susceptible to larger societal narratives that are deeply unhealthy, right? So because climate change is going to involve a lot of people getting displaced, it could also involve a lot of increases in racism and ways that people try to exploit fears of, where people are moving and new members that we need to welcome into our community because maybe they're fleeing some kind of climate crisis. And if, particularly for, for communities that do not have a good record of dealing with their emotions, right? If we are not dealing with our emotions, we can be very susceptible to very hateful messages coming through about migrants, about other things. So that's why, I think it's so important that we all are cognizant of the role of emotions here, because if we're not, those can be exploited. And there's already a lot of concerning language within climate change space of humans are part of the problem, right? You hear that a lot. And that is a deeply, deeply unhealthy way of looking at things because, we're part of the environment. And, we have the technology and we have the policy to make things better. So it's not that we are, part of the problem. It is that the people who control the resources, the legislators and the corporate CEOs that have a lot of the power, they're not doing the things that they need to do to make things healthy for everyone. So this is why it's so important to really recognize the role of emotions within climate change work, because so much of this can be exploited, right? And also, we have to recognize that, we cannot do our best work if we are feeling defeated, if we are feeling pessimistic, if we are feeling overwhelmed with negative emotions, right? And that there's a lot of importance to joy, right? Because when we feel, by the way, I see someone's in the waiting room, so I hope we can admit that person. One of the things that I talk about a lot is it's easiest to protect something that you love, right? And so when we are really in tune with here's what we really care for, here's what we love, that makes it much easier to kind of stay in the fight and stay in to protect the things we love. So this is why, we got to talk about our emotions, and we got to talk about how, climate change is not just this thing that we, are like a checkbox, check, we changed our LED light bulbs, we, we're doing water reducing things, we have better landscaping. It's also recognizing how when we look at things in the face of climate change, really reckoning with what that looks like. One of my own most profound experiences with what I would term as a climate emotion, and I'm actually thinking we had one of our participants who's here from North Carolina. And I remember a while ago, this was a few years ago, I used to do a lot more mapping work where I will talk a little bit about some interesting maps you can access. But I was doing some mapping work, and I had a bunch of archives that I was looking at along the eastern seaboard. And I started learning how to use sea level rise layers from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So what you can do when you're doing some mapping is you can have your data points, and then you can add on what would 1 foot of sea level rise look like? What would 3 feet? What would 6 feet of sea level rise look like? And I was looking at, I think it was a part of North Carolina I was looking at. And I just put on like one of the sea level rise layers, and I saw how many archives would be affected by that. And I had this thought of like, is this what an oncologist feels like when they look at scans of someone, know that that person has cancer, and then they have to go tell that person that they have cancer? And that was like my first thought was, is this what it's like to be an oncologist? Because I had this thought when I'm looking at this, it's like, these archives are going to, if we have that level of sea level rise, these archives won't exist anymore. And that was a very disturbing thing for me to sit with and feel. So I've had to deal with quite a bit of these climate emotions in my work. And they're ones that if you are working on them too, and I hope you do, I hope everyone will leave today feeling like, gosh, I have to work on this. This is something that you need to be ready for, right? It's something that you just have to sort of anticipate will happen. So climate emotions can look like all of these things over here in the left-hand corner or left-hand side of the screen. So they can look like grief, anticipatory grief. So anticipatory grief is sort of when you know that something could happen in the future, right? So I took my honeymoon in Key West, and Key West is not looking good in the future. And so I carry a lot of anticipatory grief, wondering if the place where I had my own honeymoon is going to be like, how many more decades will I be able to go there and visit in the future? It can look like sadness, fear, anxiety, guilt, helplessness, overwhelm, despair, numbness, nihilism. A lot of, climate emotions can look like all of these things. And these are typically coded as, quote, negative emotions. But I think it's also worth honoring the fact that sometimes these emotions can also propel us to action as well. And of course, there are sometimes like people who find a way to develop and generate positive emotions too through their action, through their activism. So a lot of times what you'll hear is people say, I've been sitting with all of these things, but then I found a way to feel a sense of like hopefulness or feel a sense of joy or connection when I am doing XYZ, right? So when I am joining climate activist groups, when I am, going for a hike, when I am caring for, our local community garden, these are the things that help generate some emotions that help me feel like I can stay with this. Climate emotions can come up at very specific times. So a lot of times they can be both, my experience has been like, it is both something that I experience in an ambient way and also things where sometimes there is like an acute trigger, right? So, when I'm doing my research, like sometimes I'll step back and I'll be like, wow, like I read a lot of grim stuff, but that was a really grim report, right? And I've actually dealt with that this week. But then there are sometimes things that will really hit people, right? Where, I'll go visit my family, my extended in-laws that live in Miami. And like, sometimes I'll be like looking out at all of these new builds in Miami and be like, wow, this has been built in a place that is going to flood the next time there's a hurricane. So all of these climate emotions can come up in various different ways. And I can't stress enough how important it is to anticipate these, tend to them, do what you need to do to work through them. There is a quote from Bill McKibben, who is a very famous climate activist, and people will ask him, what's the most important thing that I, as a single individual, can do for climate change? And Bill McKibben always says the most important thing you can do as an individual is to stop worrying about acting as an individual and be in community with other people. because when you're in community with other people, that both gives you a sense of purpose. It helps you kind of work through these emotions. And also, it helps you remain accountable, right? And so I have been in communities before where sometimes, like, there are people who start getting a little nihilistic, right? They get a little bit like, oh, it would just be better if humans weren't here. And other people can say, well, hold on now, like that's, that is, we're not going to do the nihilism thing, because we, again, we are part of nature, we're part of the environment. And that means that we also have responsibility for holding each other accountable and making sure that we are doing right by the earth. And also making sure that because there are going to be communities that are disproportionately impacted by climate change, communities that already are facing issues of marginalization and vulnerability, ensuring that those communities are prioritized through a climate justice framework, and making sure that, because what we have within climate change is that the communities that have contributed the least to climate change from a greenhouse gas emissions perspective are the ones that are going to be impacted the worst by it. So it's really important that when we are getting in control of our climate emotions, that we are always keeping that top of mind and making sure that those communities get what they need in order to thrive. All right, so I love the work of Just Seeds, which is this great collective of very cool social justice prints, and they have a lot of their stuff in social justice archives. And so anyway, I use a lot of their images in my slide decks. And when I was doing kind of refreshing some of my teaching work recently and looking for what's a good image that embodies climate emotions, I thought, oh, okay, I really like this one, which is that we all belong here and everything you feel is all right. Just there's no right or wrong emotions. You just have to find ways to channel them.